ICCM presents Ethical Praxis, Care Ethics and Music Teaching and Learning.
Welcome everybody today. Thank you for joining. Wonderful to see so many new people and so many familiar faces. If I could ask that you all mute during the presentation sections of today's event, and then you're welcome to unmute in discussions. We are just so pleased to start the new year with Marissa Silverman presenting our first ICCM Presents of this semester's series, which is focusing on ethics and community music. We have two strands to our online events. So strand one is the ICCM Presents, which is an invited guest speaker series that Marissa is presenting on today. We also have Deanna Jerichuk on the call, who presented last term on the criticality in community music thread with her team. Go and check that out. Fantastic event on ICCM YouTube on music and racial justice. We have Kim here joining, who also presented last term on the transforming and reproducing potentials of community music. Again, please do check that out. I think that's everyone who presented last term. If I've missed you, just unmute. Alongside the ICCM Presents series, we have ICCM Conversations. And ICCM Conversations offers a platform to those that want to investigate or offer a research-focused dialogue to our group. So the ICCM Conversations platform is there for people that want to sign up and want to have a conversation. We trial some different formats and different ways of using Zoom with breakouts and Padlets and head-to-heads and talks and so forth. We have Dave Camlin on the call today, who will be presenting 2 weeks today on the 28th of January at this time, alongside Helanda Daffen and Catherine Zesserson. And you can find the information out in our upcoming events on, actually, Dave, do you want to mention the title? Is it Group Singing for a Help? Unmute, Dave.
Group singing as healthy public, so thinking about notions of what it means to be healthy.
I think it's very pertinent in the current time, Dave. Thank you. So that's our ICCM Conversations series. That's a platform for those that want to get involved. And then today we have ICCM Present. Today we're going to stay on the call as a group for most of the call. Marissa is going to give her presentation in sections, followed by some discussion. So we welcome you to take screen breaks as needed. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so delighted for you to be here. Marissa is an associate professor at the John J. Kelly School of Music, Montclair State University. And really, with Marissa's work surrounding virtue ethics and care ethics in music education, it feels very apt to be launching our series on ethics and community music today with Marissa's presentation. So thank you so much for joining us, Marissa. I'm going to stop speaking now and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be invited to talk to you today. And when I was originally envisioning speaking to, I thought I'd pretty much be speaking to people in the UK. But looking at all the names and the faces all over the world, it's just overwhelming. So thank you for being here at whatever time of day it is for you, wherever you are. But good morning from New Jersey. And while I've traveled to the UK quite a few times, I've never been to York. So I've never been to the university of which I'm technically speaking at. And so I wanted to imagine where I'd be speaking today. And so I Google searched, like everybody does these days, your university and the city of which the school is a part. And just, wow, it's beautiful. How I'd love to get lost in one of your bookshops or wander down your cobblestone streets with or without a beverage in hand. Maybe someday. I can hope and I can dream. And isn't that two of the skills this pandemic has helped to motivate? The ability to hope and to dream, to care about and for a better tomorrow. This ability to care is both instinctual and also provoked by conscious effort. And we'll think about why this is the case. But for now, I want to preface this talk by acknowledging that what we're about to consider together is a philosophical argument that places importance on care ethics. And because of this, and because the topics pursued herein are somewhat dense and potentially riddled with more questions than answers, I will stop at various points, as Joe had mentioned, throughout our time together to help clarify things should they be somewhat muddy. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat box, and periodically I'll stop and address your comments and concerns and thoughts. So let's just dive in and begin. Even before the current global crisis, ethical concerns regained a central place in contemporary educational theorizing. But just because this is the case within scholarship and in higher education, it doesn't mean that we're done thinking and that we have the once and for all answers to why ethics are important for the teaching and learning of music. Because of this, this talk seeks to stimulate much needed reflections on all aspects of ethical thinking related to the theory and practice of music teaching and learning. Specifically, care ethical considerations are examined to highlight some of the decisions that music teachers and community music facilitators face daily. In doing so, I hope to develop a foundation for an applied ethics for music teaching and learning as ethical praxis. Now, what do I mean by applied ethics for music teaching and learning? In most philosophical circles, applied ethics seeks answers to moral questions that help navigate the ways in which we ought to live. For example, what obligation do I have to teach popular music or folk music or any other kind of music for that matter? Is community music a profession in the traditional sense of the word? However, I'm not going to attempt to answer such questions today. And so I guess in this way, I'm not really seeking traditional approach in regards to applied ethics, the field of. I do not engage with moral questions in what follows, because to me, there's a sharp distinction between morality and ethics. And if you want to talk about that, we can do so later. So instead, and for now, I seek to provide an ethical outlook that supports everyday living. But where should we begin? And how should we understand connections between ethical thinking and doing, or better stated, ethical well-being and doing with music teaching and learning? I think a good place to start is with the good life. And in order to prepare us for thinking about the good life, I suggest we watch this short video clip.
So my question to you today is, what do you practice every day? What do you practice? Because what you practice, you will get good at. What do you practice? Do you practice joy in your life? Do you practice peace in your life? Do you practice happiness in your life? Or do you practice a lot of complaining? Because if you complain, you will get very good at it. And you will get so good at it that you will find fault with everything. Even when there's no fault that a layman cannot see, you, being an expert, will see it. What do you practice? Do you practice anger? Because if you practice anger, you will get very good at it. And you will get so good at it that the most trivial you'll think, trivial thing, will make you angry. Like sitting in an airplane and watching the sea across from you somehow looks better than the one you've been given. And that is so unfair of the airlines. What do you practice? Do you practice being worried? Because if you practice being worried, you will get very good at it. And you will get so good at it that everything will worry you. including the buffalo you don't have. So I propose, if this is true that it's a question of practice, then I propose we practice joy.
So what does it mean to live a good life? In ancient Greece, the answer involved the concept of eudaimonia. This term derives from eu, meaning good or well, and daimon, which translates roughly as a spirit or one's personal fortune. Literally, then, it means something like having a good guardian spirit or a good divine power or a good fortune. And most often, the term is translated as human flourishing. According to Aristotelian ethics, human flourishing and happiness were the rewards of a virtuous life. And Aristotle wrote, quote, "Then why not say that the happy person is the one who expresses complete virtue in his activities with an adequate supply of external goods, not just for any time, but for a complete life," end quote. And now please understand, when we hear the word happy used here today, we should remember that in Aristotelian ethics, happiness rested on a foundation of virtue. And happiness, says Aristotle, quote, "seems unconditionally complete, since we always choose it because of itself, never because of something else," end quote. Human flourishing or happiness are the sums of all other ends. Additionally, for Aristotle, human flourishing and happiness occur when someone possesses excellence, who lives for the betterment of herself and her community, maintaining thereby a feeling of contentment, well-being, and comfort. There are also certain goods that help one achieve eudaimonia, flourishing, goods of the soul, including moral and intellectual virtues and education, strength, good health, beauty, good sense, and wealth, friends, good children, good reputation, and so on. According to the Canadian philosopher Mark Kingwell, eudaimonia is a kind of approval with one's character and actions, quote, "a form of reflective rationality that looks back on a life and always in a provisional way, of course, pronounces it worth living," end quote. Eudaimonia then is deemed as such when we engage in the complex self-assessment of our sense of self as connected to our projects and what we do. By asking the question, what does it mean to live the good life? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, among many other philosophers, laid a foundation for ethics. And while the Greek thinkers did not create a unified ethical theory, they have been grouped together under virtue ethics. Questions the domain of virtue ethics attempts to answer include: what is the meaning of virtue? What character traits are considered virtues? Why should one consciously work toward being virtuous? While their answers differed, there are similarities. Still, virtue ethics was and is both a philosophical domain, but also the logical, reflective, thoughtful pursuit of living the good life. Through such pursuit, reason and sensibility can lead one to virtuous living. And so virtue is both a course of action and a matter of personal choice. So how does one become good then? Through personal transformation, by working on oneself, a personal responsibility and character, virtue, well-being could be established. Virtue here is a learned habit. It is something we practice. Expressed in contemporary terms, we might say that good education involves character building, and it's by developing good character that we can potentially live a good life. And where, according to virtue ethics, do we learn how to be good? We learn to be good when we engage in positive social practices, such as those found through music making. And Aristotle had lots to say about the values of music making. Aristotle believed that the values of music making, and specifically why arts education matters, are music's potential for ethical ways of being, that a purging effect can occur when one engages in artistic pursuits. In fact, said Aristotle, the cathartic nature of the arts can restore and reinforce virtuous being. Within discussions of virtuous being, character building, and the good life, I think the issue of care should arise. Some scholars argue that ethics of care or care ethics is best understood as a category of the broader domain of virtue ethics. Others believe that the principles and foundations of Aristotle's virtue ethics may not necessarily make for a good marriage with care ethics. As Chappell noted about Aristotle particularly, quote, "It is notorious fact about Aristotle that there's something rather ruthless about his conception of eudaimonia, and that he seems to have had little room in his ethics for a notion of pity," end quote. And I'm not going to really go into these issues here in terms of the pursuit of the self and self-growth in Aristotelian ethics. Instead, the main problem that I think that we need to think through is the linking of care ethics as a category found within the domain of virtue ethics, because care, as understood in care ethics, is not necessarily or always instilled in us through training or intellectual reasoning. So what is meant as an ethic of care, and how might we understand this in relation to music teaching and community music facilitation? But before we jump into that set of questions, I wanted to just take a quick look at the chat box just to see if people are asking any questions, if there's anything that seems unclear, or if there's room now to have some discussion. So let's take a minute. Yes, of course, Dave, thank you for raising the point. The opposite, of course, is also true. Yes, that music and the arts can be mobilized to act unethically. There's many, many examples worldwide where that has been the case, and of course is currently the case. Read Thomas Torino to get great examinations of the both positive and negative forces and the ways in which music can unite both for good and for bad purposes. Thank you. Yes, for sure. Anything else to stop and think through at the moment? It's a very quick survey of virtue ethics. How are we practicing with music making and learning? Yeah, right. No, thank you, Mary. Of course, if you take what that young man said, how are we engaging in the music? What is it that we are practicing when we are practicing music making and learning? It's an interesting question, and it would be really interesting to see the many, many ways in which we practice, not just sit in a practice room and know and learn our instruments and the techniques involved therein, but how do we practice? How do we be and become music makers and music learners? Good question. Hopefully we'll have some potential answers to that the further we go into this talk today. Thank you, June. Yes, I'm so glad you're here. Happiness in Aristotle is a byproduct of the virtues rather than to be pursued. For sure, Aristotle and happiness, really for Aristotle, and I think this is both a really wonderful thing and potentially worrisome thing, is that for Aristotle, you really didn't know if you could be deemed happy until the end. It was a lifelong pursuit. And so at the end, your life was deemed happy and flourishing and worthwhile if and when you were engaged in virtuous living. So yes, thank you for making that clear. Okay, I'm gonna go back now and let's get moving with some care ethical discussion here. According to the educational philosopher Chris Higgins, he says, quote, "Good teaching itself requires a first personal answer to the first personal question, what am I doing in this classroom?" End quote. And I think by turning to care ethics, we change the question and abandon the first person pronoun. But why? Because does not what are we doing in this classroom mean something different? But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a little bit and discuss where and how care ethics emerged. Despite the work of female philosophers in ancient Greece and the Vedic traditions, and in addition to the much later work of feminist ethicists in the 1700s, most scholars argue that care ethics emerges from the work of Carol Gilligan. Gilligan's celebrated book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory in Women's Development, sought to bring women's voices into psychology, quote, to listen to women in women's terms rather than assimilate women's voices to the existing theoretical framework, end quote. And what was that framework? That of psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. Because Kohlberg engaged solely male subjects in his research, Gilligan argued that his data were biased, and therefore his stages of moral development were invalid. In her view, morality could not be universal or hierarchical, as Kohlberg had claimed. Gilligan's work discusses what she understood as characteristics of women's distinctive ethical voice. Rather than ground their understandings of morality on justice, as Kohlberg's theory seeks to do, Gilligan argues that women base their moral decision-making on relational realities. The importance of Gilligan's work lies in her alternative perspectives on decision-making when handling moral problems. In contrast to a justice perspective, which emphasizes moral principles and how principles are applied to particular cases, a care perspective attends to, quote, people's needs and how actual relations between people can be maintained or repaired, end quote. In short, Gilligan is more interested in the relational aspect of decision-making, the process of moral reasoning, rather than in a person's sense of self or character. Still, Gilligan's ideas did not in themselves amount to an ethic of care. For this, we need to examine the work of Nell Noddings. While some scholars consider Noddings a feminist thinker, her work on care did not stem from feminism. In fact, it begins with Judeo-theology, in particular, the writing of Martin Buber. As if reopening and rewriting the first line of the Old Testament, Buber says, quote, in the beginning is relation, end quote. Importantly, Buber examines the entry point of this relationship as making oneself present. He writes, quote, for the inmost growth of the self is not accomplished, as people like to suppose today, in man's relation to himself, but in the making present of another self, and in the knowledge that one is made present in his own self by the other, end quote. With these ideas in mind, Noddings formulated a theory of ethics that's relational, where we have the one caring and the cared for. For Noddings, as for most care ethicists, a caring relation occurs when we take responsibility and attend to the needs of others, where persons are relational and interdependent. And this differs from the focus on individuals' dispositions and actions that one finds in some approaches to virtue theory. Noddings explains a carer seeks out the needs of the cared for. And some critics argue that seeking out the needs of the cared for threatens to deliver the carer into a state of selflessness. For Noddings, however, this amounts to a misinterpretation. Both roles, carer and cared for, are equally important. Without recognition by the cared for, says Noddings, the caring relation is incomplete. So Noddings' ethics of care is emotionally and motivationally charged toward caring for particular others. Originally in 1984, Noddings claimed that we cannot be caring toward others we do not know because the relationship required for caring does not exist. When being moved or motivated to be kind or charitable toward strangers, we are instead acting on behalf of an ethic of justice. So one cannot act from an ethic of care when claiming to love all the world and all its peoples, because, says Noddings, care, as in the kind emphasized by care ethics, requires real encounters with known individuals. Now, care ethics has had its share of critics, both at the beginning and subsequently, and though it has evolved because of those critics. A philosopher of healthcare and nursing, Gillian Dalley, suggests that if care stems from women's experience, the result is an expectation that women and only women perform caring tasks. Such expectations accordingly will coerce women into subservient domains. And Dalley writes, quote, a view that holds women to be caring to the point of self-sacrifice is propagated at all levels, And once this central tenet of women's natural propensity to care in contradistinction to men's nature is accepted, the locus for that caring then becomes determined. With women as carers, man becomes provider, the foundation of the nuclear family is laid, and it becomes the ideal model to which all should approximate, end quote. A problem, of course. Other critics of care theory note that to hold women responsible for caring makes of caring a woman's job and leads to gendered subordination. Moreover, some critics state that any kind of relationship that proposes that one cares unconditionally for another is oppressive. Still others allege that gendering morality reinforces and perpetuates female stereotypes of all kinds. For example, theorist Joan Tronto urges care ethicists to question such gendering, to broaden their perspectives, and to consider additional aspects of judgments and justice. Notably, in order for care ethics to be taken seriously, critics argue that care ethicists must think more deeply about the connections between care and justice and resist the temptation to consign them to gendered categories. Justice-based approaches have typically avoided, though, the application of emotion, which is stereotypically seen as feminine, to moral or intellectual reasoning, whereas care ethics regards emotions as necessary. And philosopher Virginia Held writes, quote, "The ethics of care values emotion rather than rejects it. In contrast with the dominant rationalist approaches, such emotions as sympathy, empathy, sensitivity, and responsiveness are seen as the kind of moral emotions that need to be cultivated not only to help in the implementation of the dictates of reason, but to better ascertain what morality recommends," end quote. Because care ethics is relational, it includes and depends on emotions, for emotional reactions are central, or at least they should be, in guiding action in interpersonal situations and scenarios. Rather than being liabilities, emotions help us determine what is best to do. But does justice factor into this? Are the private and the public reconcilable within an ethic of care? While some theorists believe that justice has no place in care ethics, others disagree. An important distinction is found in the unequal relationship between the carer and the cared for, and Noddings addresses this. She writes, quote, "First, carer and cared for are not permanent labels attached in stable and distinct ways to two different sets of people. They are labels for the parties in an encounter or in a series of encounters in a continuing relationship. Except in structurally unequal relationships, e.g., parent-child, teacher-student, physician-patient, both parties are expected to act as carers when they are so addressed by another. The ethic of care binds carers and cared fors in relationships of mutual responsibility," end quote. Indeed, and perhaps a better perspective is the concept of mature care, a term coined by Carol Gilligan. Quote, "Mature care seems to highlight the relational aspect of the persons involved in the caring relationships of which each of them partakes," end quote. And about this, philosopher Tove Peterson notes that the term mature indicates that caring skills can be developed in most people. Additionally, quote, "The mature care point of view transcends both mere self-interest and the narrow focus of one or a few particular others. In this conception of care, one starts by emphasizing a fundamental equality and underlines that even if other concern is mandatory, self-care is not by definition unethical, and that excessive altruism may be unethical," end quote. Held writes that, quote, "Justice and care as values each involve associated clusters of moral considerations, and these considerations are different. Actual practices should usually incorporate both care and justice, but with appropriately different priorities," end quote. She adds, however, that care is much more fundamental to humanity than justice. There can be care without justice, but not the reverse. Quote, "There has historically been little justice in the family, but care and life have gone on without it. There can be no justice without care, however, For without care, no child would survive and there would be no persons to respect, end quote. Now, why the need to include justice in an ethic of care, especially when justice is typically focused on rights rather than needs, fairness rather than trust, abstract principles rather than caring relationships? And some theorists claim that an ethics of care is neglectful and falls short when it comes to social injustice, that justice takes into account the larger world and its institutions, seeking to confront laws that foster inequality. And this leads us to the consideration of the difference between caring about and caring for. Noddings states that caring about may serve us well when considering issues of justice. Because care ethics is relational, and because we cannot care directly for everyone, we need to think about how a theory of ethics would treat societal issues, those involving social justice. Noddings writes, quote, "When there is no provision for direct encounter and reception of the all-important response for the cared for, we try to employ some form of justice in our policies. Justice does not become irrelevant when we embrace an ethic of care," end quote. And so we might consider the needs and the rights of another a bit differently. And this we again can turn to Noddings because she says, quote, "Caring about may inspire caring for." And what might this look like in action?
In order to be able to work in a hospital, two abilities, but true ones, are necessary. First, the ability of the musician, that is, his ability to perform with musical instruments, as well as with his voice. The second ability is the ability to relate, to give meaning to the musical gestures towards the other. That's not so easy. It's not just a question of goodwill, just the intention to relate, but learning to look, to place oneself in space, to adapt one's work to a situation. We have had record players in the hospital for many years, but the arrival of musicians is an introduction of life, of people with their own personalities and feelings, offering a deeper contact with the children. There is also an exchange between musicians, parents, and children, but mainly between the music and the expression of the children's eyes, between the music and their smiles. Live music offers in this sense much more than any musical equipment.
Bien supérieur à ça.
This work goes in the direction of a global approach of the sick person in his or her environment. We saw how not only the child, but also the parents, the attendants at the hospital, are involved. It seems interesting to me, especially at a time when medicine, hospitals are becoming ever more technological, to reintroduce the dimension of the human being as a whole. Because, after all, you are taking care of a child and not of a sickness.
Okay, I'm back. What did this kind of caring for, as exemplified in this hospital setting, imply? Empathy. And there are a few different ways to understand the importance of empathy here. First, and notably, the self can only be understood in its relation to another. No other, no sense of self. Second, empathy allows us to be and become an understanding person or teacher who is sensitive to the feelings, thoughts, difficulties, needs, and desires of others, of students. Viewing empathy this way reminds us that empathy, when is receptive. It is not like sympathy, which asks that we project ourselves onto another. Empathy is receptive insofar as we become one who listens to express needs. Educative and compassionate teaching asks us to be aware of and alert to how school and community music participants feel about how they're learning to make and listen to music, how they feel about and respond to what we're doing as educators, how others in their learning community respond to them or not, and how we can improve students' experiences in these regards. Viewing teaching and learning music through this intersubjective lens, rather than a purely objective knowledge-focused lens, is essential if teachers want to teach music musically, effectively, and meaningfully. And so that's probably a lot to take in. At least I think it is. For me, it is. So I just wanted to stop and pause and see what people are thinking in the chat box, and invite you to raise any comments or concerns or even questions. Thanks, June. Yes. For those who weren't checking the chat box, June writes that nodding's stretch on mutuality makes her version different from the patronizing sort of care that often underpins the less aware justice seeking. Yes, for sure. Thank you very much. So it's a relationship. It's not just give. And it's not just, assuming the needs of the others. It's also listening to express needs of others. Dave, thanks for sharing. Yes, sometimes we find that we are caring of those who always took care of us. As children, we are in more often than not, and in very different kinds of ways, asked to care for the needs of those who are typically supposed to take care of us. And so those roles are not set in stone, and they're not forever. And it doesn't really matter how old we are when we're in that kind of a relationship. Seeking out the needs of others, I would be interested to talk more on that with regards to critique of paternalistic practices in community music and music education. Seeking out the needs of others. It's difficult. It's not always so obvious, and it's not always readily available to us. But we'll talk more about that as we continue on in the talk. Yes, thank you for bringing up Viktor Frankl, Dave. Self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Self-actualization, knowing oneself, is easier said than done. And sometimes we have to be in those relationships with another in order to know ourselves. We can see ourselves more clearly times when we relate well with others. These fit well with relational centered care and dementia care, plus the notion of Ubuntu and the communitarian politics. The individual is formed by the relationships with the community and society around them. Yes, there are many types of social realms and cultures around the world where everything that I'm saying so far is perfectly clear and practiced daily. But there are plenty of cultures and societal domains around the world that this kind of relational understanding and living and practicing every day is not so automatic. And so I think it's important, especially if we are in situations, schools, any kind of domain where there's a structure put in place, that we need to be mindful of the ways in which we relate to and with others. And yes, thank you, Tony, for bringing up the American public school system, case in point, of course. And we can talk more about that as we go on. Okay, and so to this point, up until now, I've tried to map an ethical position that discusses the nature of human relations, namely interdependency. I believe this enables us to conceive of living the good life in terms of relationality. A good life, I submit, depends on the ways I relate to and with others, on my success at achieving my caring best. When engaged in teaching and learning, particularly of music, which is so emotional, we must first and foremost think of self-other coupling and the dynamics of relationships. However, as my personal teaching experiences have taught me, it is difficult to do my caring best when no one reciprocates my caring, when my own health and well-being is at risk. Is not being selfish when we attend to the needs of others, is not being selfish when we attend to the needs of ourselves. There is a very good reason the airlines ask us to place the oxygen mask before attending to the needs of others. If we're dead, literally or metaphorically, we cannot best care about the needs or for the needs of other people. Additionally, caring can be compromised when the institutions of schooling are not caring or care directed, but rather skills and measurement directed. Indeed, many of our institutions have been hijacked by administrators and managers who have failed to recognize that one of their most fundamental responsibilities is to create a sustainable environment where care, both for and of both student and self, can thrive. In a bad marriage, divorce may be a good thing, but what can we do in schooling? Urge students to leave, suggest that teachers resign, work with parents for change. What should school music teachers and community music facilitators do in such situations? When a school or organization operates with appropriate attention to respecting and caring for teachers and students, Nodding's next point is crucial. When we enter the teaching profession, Noddings argues, we should enter knowing that we are engaged in a very special relationship, the caring relationship. Quote, no enterprise or special function I am called upon to serve can relieve me of my responsibilities as one caring, end quote. Indeed, she continues, if something arises that prevents a teacher from acting upon her caring best, she must refuse to participate. Caring for the other is part of the craft of teaching. In Nodding's words, quote, as teacher, I am first one caring, end quote. Drawing from Buber, Noddings emphasizes the meeting, the I, thou, and the attendant idea of inclusion when the one caring tries to teach the cared for. Quote, in inclusion, the teacher receives the student and becomes in effect a duality. This sounds mystical, but it is not. The teacher receives and accepts the student's feeling toward the subject matter. She looks at it and listens to it through his eyes and ears. How else can she interpret the subject matter for him? As she exercises this inclusion, she accepts his motives, reaches toward what he intends, so long as these motives and intentions do not force an abandonment of her own ethic. Inclusion, as practiced by the teacher, is a vital gift. The special gift of the teacher then is to receive the student, to look at the subject matter with him. Her commitment is to him, the cared for, and he is, through the commitment, set free to pursue his legitimate projects, end quote. Here, the student becomes the teacher's apprentice, and teacher and student work towards achieving something together. Through modeling, dialogue, practice, and confirmation, the teacher helps the student become a better version of herself. And part of this work together is the give and take of caring that stems from either instinctual or ethical caring. And these are two different kinds of caring. From the perspective of instinctual caring, the carer, for example, a loving parent, determines naturally and intuitively what the cared for, in this case the child, needs in a given situation and responds accordingly. Motivated by love and concern, the carer feels and responds to the needs of the other. Ethical caring may include reflective thinking, intentions, and an I must focus that is not engaged in instinctual caring. In ethical caring, we enact caring as a vision of our best ethical selves. One of the purposes of ethical caring is to restore the natural order of things and to return to the ideal state of instinctual caring. When teachers and students embark on this journey together, the one caring, whether instinctually or ethically, contributes to the growth of the cared for and maintains conditions within which caring can flourish. When in situations that are difficult, trying, or taxing to our self-growth or self-needs, we have recourse to ethical caring, which ideally will sustain the caring relationship despite difficult conditions. As long as the cared for feels and recognizes this care, the carer and cared for are in it together. This recognition seems particularly important, and the recognition of caring by the cared for does not have to be elaborate or grandiose. Sometimes a sincere smile can be enough. In fact, a good example of the recognition of caring by the cared for in music making is the cooing an infant emits when singing along with mother or father. We know that maternal singing, paternal singing is an actual expression of felt love, and the infant's emotional response is reciprocally loving. The infant is saying, without saying so, I am receiving your love and care in this moment that we have created together. Noddings argues that when I care for another, I care for myself. Carer, cared for, and relation are all sustained. Noddings notes that this mutuality is important when relationships are particularly unequal. So again, doctor-patient, teacher-student, mother-child, father-child, because mutual care between carer and care for may help to avoid burnout. She writes, quote, teachers should choose methods that contribute to their own happiness and growth. As carers, they will, of course, be concerned with the growth and happiness of their students, but because so much depends on the health of teacher-student relations, teachers should reflect continually on the effects of their choices on themselves, as well as their students and their relations, end quote. And this is not to say that the goods of teaching are solely or entirely relational. Music teaching and learning includes the development of students' awareness of their ever-changing sense of self, the enhancement of students' creative and academic growth, their personal well-being, and much, much more. Still, it seems unlikely that any of these goods can really grow, develop, flourish, or thrive in an uncaring environment. As Wayne Bowman says, education is, first and foremost, relational. And my key point is this. When we engage in relational care as music teachers and community music facilitators, when we are at our caring best, we do not need to invest inordinate amounts of energy because our actions and reactions are motivated by empathy, compassion, and concern. Again, and it's an important question, especially now, what do we do when we find ourselves in situations that are not supportive or conducive to this state? Educational philosopher Jim Garrison reflects on this question, and he explains that the problems we face in society are problems for us in our classrooms. Quote, because we care best for ourselves only if we care for others, and care for others only if we care for ourselves. In a holistic, organic, and growing world, good care is expansive. Expansive caring is loving bestowal. It bestows value not only on others, but also on ourselves. If we are vulnerable, we are open to loss, but we are also open to becoming, growth, the need to care for ourselves, and the need to be needed, end quote. While most virtue ethicists would concur with most of the ideas I've outlined so far, I believe because virtue ethics' starting point is with the self and virtuous character rather than the relational, this branch of ethics may be missing an opportunity to reclaim importance in teaching of things like feeling and love. As Chappell writes, quote, love is a thing that can test beyond the whole idea of morality to an ethical outlook, end quote. Among teachers' important roles is the responsibility to act in loco parentis, in place of the parent. Given that, it's difficult to conceive of teaching and learning without love. And so what does this mean for us? I want to share with you something that I hope will clarify things a little bit and give an example of care as love and music in action. I had to let the applause go because I wouldn't be able to speak after after listening to him saying. For those who don't know this community choir, it's a group located in Northampton, Massachusetts, and the average age of the participants is 81. And as soon as you leave this online lecture, I know I'm not supposed to tell you what to do, that's not very caring of me, but as soon as you leave this online lecture, go to Amazon Prime or Apple Movie or wherever and watch the documentary. The previously shown clip is taken from, it's called Young at Heart. Because the film was made for British television, maybe many of you have seen the documentary. And if you haven't, watch it as soon as possible and have a box of tissues close by. When the film was released in 2007, on a whim, I decided to see it in the theaters. And let's just say I sobbed through most of it. This group of singers puts their spin on all sorts of music, including punk classics like Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash, or I Want to Be Sedated by the Ramones. And after experiencing the film, I saw the chorus perform live twice when they were on tour. It's clear to me that this chorus, its members, its director, Bob Silman, its audiences are living the good life. They're experiencing and expressing themselves through each other through music. When they experience and express themselves through music, they gain a sense of self-knowledge, self-other knowledge, self-growth, self-other growth, and self-esteem that they couldn't gain otherwise. And related to self-other understanding, this relational understanding is the value of community. Music making connects us to those we are engaged with musically. There are a number of reasons for this. First, music making is, or can be anyway, emotionally engaging and arousing. When music makers are emotionally engaged, they're likely to connect with those who are part of this emotional engagement. Also, they become in sync, literally and figuratively, with others. And being in sync connects them to others they wouldn't be connected to otherwise. Relationships form because of musical experiences, and a community is born. With that comes trust, commitment, fellowship, well-being, and so on. The value of community yields exponential dividends. However, this isn't the only kind of community that music teaching and learning and community music yields. By engaging with music written by and for others, in the case of this chorus, they sing songs by the likes of The Police, Sonic Youth, James Brown, Bob Dylan, Madonna, Pink Floyd, more. They connect to people, places, and times far removed from their own here and now. And this kind of time-space travel and communality is so rewarding. Additionally, a key value of their musical engagement through this community music teaching and learning is happiness, or as stated at the outside of this talk, eudaimonia, or human flourishing. By showing us we are never too old to rock on, this chorus teaches us something much greater, that life goes on until it doesn't. They are exclaiming this quite loudly. They are singing, make the most of life by being with and for each other. Music teaching and learning and community music as relational, as enacted through care ethics, like that showcased through the good work of this chorus, reminds us that being present for each other is the most important gift, the most important reality. And foundationally, teaching and learning should be needs-based. Music teaching and learning environments should be founded on reciprocity between the carer and the cared for, despite the asymmetrical relationships that undemocratic environments tend to impose on teachers and students. A central aim should be mutual respect, attention, and recognition of equal worth, through which Peterson suggests both the carer and cared for contribute to the caring relationship. Teachers and students need to work together then to create spaces of trust, community, and commitment where the educational and personal needs and desires of both students and teachers are acknowledged and respected. Where an ethic of caring and mutuality is central, the carer, the teacher, should find ways to engage students in discussing safely their feelings, dispositions, and attitudes towards issues, controversies, tensions, and consequences that arise in the music classroom and beyond. Music educators and community music facilitators would profit from understanding that identity formation and the interrelatedness of self and other does not reside solely in the head. Selfhood is of the world of personal relationships as much as it is genetic, psychological, and so forth. The interrelatedness of musical, social, emotional, and biological identities emerges from collaborative processes of music making and music listening. Facilitating caring relationships in collaborative classrooms enhances opportunities for transformative musical effective positive interpersonal relationships, and for democratic agency. And if these points are valid, perhaps we need to acknowledge the possibility that at some point in a child's schooling, and after engaging with a variety of music making pursuits in schools and community music programs, music classes in school or community music programs may not be a good fit for all students everywhere, any more than, say, dance or physics are suited to the needs and desires of every student. In a caring relationship, the degree of a student's commitment to music or dance or physics or whatever is not the measure of a student's personhood. Caring curricula should be individualized and personalized as much as possible. And from the care ethic perspective, unless the carer and cared for acknowledge that a given curriculum matters, there is a real danger that schooling will become forced and counterproductive. And teachers and students often find themselves in circumstances that are inimical to care and caring. And to speak to this, I will draw upon some of my own previous teaching experiences as a secondary school teacher in New York City. I taught in a very large school, originally intended to hold 2,500 students. Instead, it housed approximately 4,300 students. The student body spoke 58 languages across the community beyond English. In addition to teaching instrumental music and English literature classes at every grade level, I regularly taught a course called Music Appreciation, which held 55 students and met at 7 o'clock every morning. My school administration labeled the majority of the students in this class as at risk or reluctant learners. It's a great label. It's quite awful. Their ages ranged from 14 to 20. Their ethnicities were diverse: Puerto Rican, Jamaican, Haitian, Indian, Pakistani, Greek, Mexican, Korean, so on. And in this music appreciation class that I taught, I tracked how many languages met the top, and that were 28. In one semester, I had 28 different languages spoken by the students. About 10% were recent immigrants. That was regularly across all my years teaching, and many required instructional support services or special education. I found that the more I engaged my students in the what, why, and how of music class, the more we created an environment that was conducive to education through music, a place where the meaning of community seemed possible. For example, after asking about and considering the students' musical and dance abilities, I shared my knowledge. Rather, I shared myself with them. I taught them the musics and dances of the waltz, the jazz swing, the twist, the Charleston. Most importantly, and this was the key point, they taught me. Through my students, I learned how to listen to and dance salsa, bachata, merengue. A Tibetan student brought a video of national Tibetan dancing. A Bengali student brought Indian hip hop and her beloved Bollywood. She taught us dancing she loved and reminded her of some place where she belonged. The students became comfortable with me and I with them. We eventually reached a place and a space where we trusted one another, where no one's music was better than another, and where we cared about and cared for not only each other's music, but our intersubjective sense of self as a class. Was it always perfect? No. Did we have our disagreements? Yes. As one caring though, and I know I made mistakes, but because the caring relation was the starting point, the possibility was left open for me to correct myself if and when I misjudged, overstepped, or fell short. However, and because we acknowledged one another, I found that when I introduced the students to unfamiliar music making and listening, like castrati singing, or French, German, Italian Baroque music, or Beethoven's evolutionary and revolutionary role in the history of Western classical music, or 21st century new music, they were more comfortable, more open, and more eager to learn. And here's a potentially good analogy. Unless you call for an Uber or Lyft car, would you get into a car with a stranger and ask that stranger to take you somewhere you'd never been before? The same is true of students, especially those whom life has taught them to be wary of others. Why should they go along for the ride with you? Just because you're their teacher and you say it's good for them? Just because you say you care about them? How do they know you're telling the truth? How do they know you're for real? You need to show them, not just with your words, but with your actions, with the ways in which you openly care about yourself and them. They need to see your vulnerability. They need to see you admit when you're wrong. They need to know that you will not disappoint them, that you will not take them to a place that goes against the very core of their being. They need to know you will not hurt them. And if and when you do so unwillingly and unknowingly, they need to know you didn't mean to, and that you would do what was needed to be better. They need to know that you will honor and cherish who they are as people, because in the beginning is relation. So we grew together in acknowledging, welcoming, and understanding unfamiliar music, and therefore unfamiliar others. I was not the only teacher in the room. My students, my young colleagues were continuously excited, proud to see their music. Thus, a lesson on musical virtuosity was not dedicated only to Liszt and Paganini. They brought in Eminem and Jay-Z. I introduced them to Wynton Marsalis. They brought in Daddy Yankee. I played and discussed Vladimir Horowitz. They shared the musical style features of Mary J. Blige. I didn't replace theirs, I embraced them. I didn't neglect their cultures. I tried to enrich them as they did mine. In the process, we quickly forgot that the classroom was seriously overcrowded. 55 students makes a large general music classroom under any conditions, that the CD player sometimes did not work properly, that the air conditioner never worked, and that the clock on the wall was always wrong, and that many, many dangers existed beyond our classroom from which our music community could not protect any of us. Additionally, I found that I was much more than these students' teacher. I was their confidant, their creator of a safe space. And so let me just share just a few examples with you. We often listen to albums such as A Tribe Called Quest's Low End Theory. We listen not only for enjoyment, but for the purposes of creating our own rap responses. One student said, "This is my favorite class. I really love coming here." And now some teachers might treat this comment lightly or as superficial praise. I usually ask more questions to find out about the life values that students receive from their participation in our class. As it turned out, for this particular student at this time, music class was the only escape in his life. 10 days prior to this remark, he confided to me that he had come home from school to find his youngest brother dead after suffering from AIDS-related complications. Another student said to me, "Beethoven's my favorite composer. He's just like me. I had to deal with a lot of crap. He lived a really hard life. I downloaded Moonlight Sonata and I listen to it all the time, especially when my dad gets in my face. This music makes me feel better." Another student said to me, I love that Bach piece you played for us. It makes me feel like I'm back home in Brazil. I miss being home. I miss my dad. I won't get to see him again for another 6 months. Can we find more music like this? These stories may seem altruistic, only I did not and do not consider my motivation to be altruistic in nature, because I cared and I continue to care about these young people. When we realized that we needed each other, this reciprocity completed the circle of care, with the result that our caring and our relationships took precedent over all adverse conditions. What does praxis mean? It's a word that we keep on throwing around in academic circles. Well, it means something different depending upon the scholar you ask. And for me, praxis means asking myself and answering the following questions. What kind of person is it good to be? And what do others need? And since I'm thinking about the praxis of music teaching and learning, I need to ask and answer these questions in relation to the many variables, the musical and educational variables of a given teaching and learning encounter. So, what kind of person is it good to be? And what do others need through musical actions and engagements that are critically reflective for the development of personal and community flourishing and well-being and the positive transformation of people and their everyday lives? I believe it's imperative for teachers, facilitators, and students who care about themselves and education to focus on personal and public caring, happiness, and joy. When someone is cared for, she's loved. This, for me, is music teaching and learning as praxis. Thanks, Frank.
Wow, Marissa, thank you so, so much. I wonder if you want to pause your screen share now, and I really feel that, so we're talking about connecting with each other. So can I just ask you all to unmute and give Marissa a round of applause, because that was just absolutely...
Thank you for being here.
Now, Marissa, you've already addressed a number of the comments in the chat. Thank you for doing that throughout your presentation. But we do have some time right now. Impeccable timing, I should say.
Why, thank you.
Fantastic. We do have some time for a group conversation. So I can see there's some threads in the chat. I might invite you to pick up on some of them, but others that perhaps are not accessing the chat might want to just unmute and ask a question or pose a comment. You're very welcome to do that as well. I'm just having a look through my screens of you all here. So many of us today, that's fabulous. Maybe
I just wanted to pick up on one point, because I do see it in the chat a couple times, you know, the ethic of love and the ethic of care. And yes, I've written about that before. I think they need to be I think they already are a marriage. They just need to be made explicit a little bit more in writing and in thinking. And that distinction really comes and the caring for. And so I think the more that we care for, we are envisioning an ethic of love, which to me is part of an ethic of care. The more that we are caring about, obviously we are still in that domain of care ethics, which love is sort of teetering on the outside, but the possibility is always there, because, as Nodding says, and I think that she's right, caring about can inspire a caring for. And I think that is true, especially in that hospital video with the music therapists. There was something that the way in which they were looking at each other while they were in the moments of musical reception. And if that's not an expression of felt love, at least in that moment, you know, you are the music while the music lasts. In that moment of musical connection, I do believe there is a love there. I think there's a lot in that, and certainly not something that a quick and easy kind of discussion can manifest in. But I think that there are ways in which that they are connected already. So thanks to, I think, Dave, who brought it up, and a few others who brought it up earlier in the chat box. And so I'm going to shut up because I'm tired of hearing my voice.
Marissa, thank you so much. I wonder, those people that were talking about that in the chat, if you want to unmute now and elaborate on that a little more, there is some time to. I can't see everybody, so I'll just stop speaking and see if we have some sound come forward. Okay, maybe not. Let's pick up on some other points then. So just having a look, I was wondering, there was a big discussion about positionality. I don't know if you noticed that as well, Marissa, in the chat, and connecting this. I see that Katie Cassio, can I see you there? I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the comments you were adding there. If not, I can read them. So Katie was mentioning addressing the constructed hierarchies and an insistence on inherent reciprocity between beings in learning and caring relationships, and is drawing on Toolbear's work. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit more, Marissa. No.
Well, actually, I would love to hear from the people who are bringing that up. I guess, I mean, I think I hear what you're saying, but I'm wondering if there's a question therein that would help me sort of, dive in more specifically, because I don't want to open up a huge can of worms and then say, bye world, in 10 minutes. So if Katie, if you want to sort of reframe what you stated in the chat box as a question, maybe that might be helpful at this particular moment.
Juliana was also, Juliana, you look like you're going to speak actually. We're in sync.
Yeah, because Katie just left, and I just texted her, hey, someone is like, you have to go and come back to the call, but she has to teach. It's okay. 7 a.m. here in Seattle. Yes, and I was also piggybacking on this idea of intersectionality, because it's all very beautiful, but if we don't have the layer of positionality, then it's superficial. Understanding contexts and where we're coming from and who we're working with, not in a paternalistic way of thinking. It's like, oh my gosh, yes, I'm bringing the music. Yeah, right. But how are we understanding our positionality within the work that we do in terms of care? And I know at the beginning of the talk, someone was talking about how can we talk about these paternalistic ways that have been part of music education. So it almost feels like we're going full circle here. But yeah, can you speak a little bit more about intersectionality? I really missed seeing more of that. It was a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. But since Katie brought that up, I'm going to follow on that. Thank you.
Sure. So I think the important, well, first off, when we engage in an ethic of care, it does not mean we can't also engage in an ethic of justice. So just because you do one doesn't mean you can't do others. It's not a once and for all label that you live under. Second, I think Notting's point about assumed needs and expressed needs are incredibly important. And so listening is the basis for care. You cannot truly say that you care for another if you do not hear them. And I don't mean to be laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's so unconscionable to me that people do not begin relationships by listening very often. They begin relationships by speaking. And that to me is not a real authentic relationship in this kind of a domain of care ethics. If we are engaged in care ethics, we are receiving the other first and foremost. We are listening to the expressed needs of the other. We are not going in there assuming we know what's right for you. We go in assuming that you know what's right for you and that you will help us who are coming into work with, not for, with you. and that you will help us be best for you. I can't remember, he's such a great educational theorist. His name mistakes me. It's not coming to me. It may come to me later, and I may just shout out a name, and if I do, I apologize. But he was, before he became a scholar and an educational theorist, maybe it's Michael Apple. Anyway, I'm not sure. He was a kindergarten teacher. And always the first question he asked of parents at parent-teacher conferences was, what do I need to know about your child to be a better teacher for him or her? Before getting into any kind of conversation about that student and how he or she was in, it was always, help me be a better teacher for your child. You know your son or daughter in ways that I can never. So what is it that I need to know about this kid that's going to make me better for him or her? And I often think about that, and I often think about how very often we assume, and by we, when we're in positions of power, that we know what's good for other people. We don't. I don't know what it feels like to be anybody else but myself. And so because of that, I need to know who I'm working with as well as I possibly can from those people themselves in order to know what we as a group feel is right to do for us. So I don't know if that helps at all. I don't know if having those concepts at the front, so the difference between needs and expressed needs, and the importance of listening, and how that's the foundation for moving forward in any kind of relationship. So I hope it just helps a little bit kind of allude to some potential ways forward.
Thank you.
I really want to
question.
say something, but I think I probably talk too much as well, so I don't want to kind of keep on just jumping in.
Well, we do still have some good time for discussion, Dave. So if you want
I don't want to take it in a different direction. I'm interested in drawing this back to music as well. So for me, the thinking about music, it strikes me that one of the foundations of what lies behind like a music, the reason that musical brings about a sense of attachment and connection, it has a neurobiological foundation. So when we're attuning to each other through music, we're actually attuning to each other at a neurobiological level. That's not to bypass aspects of biology or culture, but it's to create a temporary, it's what Marx would call an interstice, a space where we can encounter each other outside of those things. It's not to say we can bypass them, but it provides the space for an encounter where the encounter is at a more human level based on our neurobiology rather than our biology or our culture.
No, that's a fantastic point. I mean, and that's without explicitly realizing that's why I brought it up, but that was one of the reasons that I brought up the infant and sort of singing together in that moment. The infant hasn't yet gone to music school, but is automatically attuned to mirror, and those are brain, body, mind systems, to mirror what the one that she believes loves and cares for is doing. And so from a very, very young age, and even within the womb, all of those womb studies are so amazing and so interesting. The ways in which we synchronize neurobiologically through music because of musical engagement and emotional arousal that we're not even conscious of. These are all non-conscious levels. They are just happening to us. They're just firing in us. And so we become connected in those musical moments very often, whether we want to or we don't. And the more often we can harness that and we can really utilize that as fuel for connectivity, I think we're in a real position to affect change positively. and to hope for transformation in positive ways. So Dave, yes, your point is well taken about the ways and the mechanisms in which music really does affect us on a very, very deep, personal, and physical, quite physical level.
I sort of have something else, if I could possibly ask a bit of a question that sort of, I think, builds on that in some way, especially this idea of interstice. I first came across your work, Marissa, through reading Juliet Hess. And I think in what your projects you're looking at there, you're creating a safe space in your classroom, right? And Juliet Hess, she says, look to the opportunity to go past that safe space to somewhere more uncomfortable. And I think in the world we're living in now, there's an imperative to do that, where that may be, as you're saying, what do we need from each other? That caring relationship, which isn't just about creating a nice space, is about how do we tackle the actual challenges that we have in front of us. I think, is that something that you deal with in these classes, or is that something that sort of that happens in other spaces?
Sure. No, I am uncomfortable all the time. I am made uncomfortable by people and for people and with people because I think that's the nature of growth. I think the only way we can stretch who we are is when we do something that makes us feel uneasy. Stasis happens, and then we're just very comfortable being where we're at. So I'm very often aware of all of those uncomfortable moments. And while I was teaching, I mean, the reason that I became the teacher that I became was because my students made me incredibly uncomfortable. They told me how terrible I was. They told me how incredibly narrow and incredibly, in many ways, unassumingly wrong I was for them. I mean, they didn't put it so nicely. They put it really quite bluntly. And I heard them and I listened to them, and I went home and I cried. And then I came back the next day and I said, okay, we're changing everything that we're doing. I went in there with a very prescribed curricula that was handed down to me by the administration of the school. I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I was doing it as best as I could. I was a good musician. I mean, I did the best that I could. And one day, this one student in the back of the room, she just stood up and said, "You suck." And again, that's a very nice way of how she put it. And I was shocked, but I listened to her and I asked other questions, and I asked the kids, I said, what's going on here? Like, I don't really understand where all this anger is coming from. And they let me have it. And like I said, I went home and I cried and I cried and I cried, and I came back the next day and I was a completely different teacher. And that was because I was uncomfortable, because I was listening to them, because I wasn't assuming that I knew what was right for them when I didn't really know who they were. So I became a totally different teacher because of those uncomfortable moments. So thanks for raising that question.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Marissa.
Sure.
Marissa and I actually am feeling very uncomfortable too.
At the time.
Towards the end of the session, sorry for a bit of a cheesy newsreader presenter. But yeah, I feel like the conversation is really warming up, and I personally have lots more questions that I'd love to discuss. At this point, therefore, I invite you all to just copy the chat, make sure you've shared the chat. You can take away from that later. I don't know if people wanted to be connected with sharing email addresses, but I might send a follow-up email about that. So if people wanted to get in touch, or you could just direct message each other now and get each other's emails to stay in contact. I don't want to just call a blunt end without checking that there isn't a burning question amongst the group that hasn't featured in the chat. So I'm just having a little look. Can't see one. Okay, so we'll bring it to a bit of an uncomfortable, abrupt ending there, Marissa, because I realise people have the next things to go on to. But thank you so much. Dave has mentioned in the chat, as you can see, Dave Camlin, that he'll be picking up on some of the points that he has offered to the group today in our next event, which will take place 2 weeks today on the 28th of January, a Thursday, 2 p.m. GMT, 9 a.m. EST. I'm mentioning those time zones because that's where I and Marissa are joining from, but do check the time zone calendar. You need to book to attend, and I've put the link in the chat. I think there's some more links coming there too from Rory. We can catch up on this event on the YouTube channel, and I just want to say I think that's everything that needs to be said from now. Oh yeah, if you want to hear more from us or want to learn about the work at the International Centre for Community Music and events and publications and so forth, then do join our mailing list. The link is there. But I think we'll wrap up. And Marissa, I just want to say thank you like so much. That was just so rich. And
thanks for having me.
Have another round of applause.
That's very kind. Thank you all for having me, for listening, for being here. I appreciate it.
Really fantastic. I think we'll stop the call there. I'm going to stay on, and for those at ICCM, if you want to stay on too, Marissa, very welcome to stay on. But if I can say goodbye to everybody else and see you next time. Thank you so much for joining. Lovely to see you all, and see you next time.